Hello, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here speaking on the Interactive Past conference. It's a great shame not to be there in person, but I hope everybody's having a great time, and thank you very much to the organisers. My name is Robert Houghton. I'm a senior lecturer up at the University of Winchester, just on the other side of the channel, and I'm here today to talk to you about ahistorical games and how these games are not only useful for research through play, but how they have certain advantages over more traditional methods of approaching the Middle Ages. So, as I've said, I'm a lecturer up at the University of Winchester. Most of my research concerns Italy in the 10th and the 11th centuries. However, I've been doing an increasing amount of work on the representations of the Middle Ages in modern games, so tabletop games, but also and increasingly computer games. And this has incorporated the ways in which the Middle Ages are represented in this media. It's also incorporated how we can use games for teaching purposes, how we can use them in the classroom to further our students' experience. And increasingly, I've been using my research to look at how we can use computer games as a means of researching the Middle Ages and history more generally. And I'm not alone in this research. There's various other people working in these areas, most notably, I think, Vinicius Cavallo, who everyone should make sure they're up to date with his work. He's got a lot of fantastic stuff going on. But from my perspective, I think games, we can use computer games, we can use tabletop games for research purposes in several ways. I think we can use these games to express historical data, to show built environments. We can use them to create historical arguments through their mechanics, through their rules, and ultimately we can use these games to facilitate historical debates. But if we accept that game rules and game mechanics represent historical arguments, then by extension, if we modify those rules and mechanics, then in turn we modify the arguments they represent. And in doing so, we're in effect conducting historical debate by modifying games. So I think there's a huge amount of potential here. And one of the games that I think possibly demonstrates a direction in which this research, this use of games as historical research could go, is Crusader Kings II. So I should say I've been involved with the production of Crusader Kings II and the recently released Crusader Kings III. I'm credited on both items. But Crusader Kings II, well, it's a grand strategy game. It's similar in many respects to games like Total War, to Sydney's Civilization, but it's incredibly deep. It represents a vast area, not restricted not only to Europe, but down into sub-Saharan Africa, over as far as India, and up into the steppes of Asia. And one of the things that makes Crusader Kings so unique is it's a very deep game. So you can play as the rulers of any of the kingdoms across this vast area, but you can also play a couple of levels of society further down. You can play as dukes, you can play as counts. So if you want to play as the Count of Dublin, for example, you can go ahead and do that. That's absolutely fine. And what this means, that's the other thing as well, Crusader Kings II spans a huge time period, from the 8th century through to the 15th century. And over most of this time period, you can pick any day, any character, and start playing as any character. And as a result, Crusader Kings has a vast character database. I believe when the final expansion was released, I believe it was in excess of 500,000 figures were recorded within this database. So it's huge. And most of these figures are actual people. So we've got the example here is Harold Godwinson, King of England, and the runner-up in King Idol 1066. And these people have been created through research, often through potentially spurious sources. So Wikipedia has been used to support the creation of many of these figures, but also from more academically sound sources. Medieval Lands, a prosopography of medieval European noble and royal families from Charles Crawley, has been used extensively to support the creation of this database. And there's even been some even more academic texts, like academic databases used. The Monumenta Germania Historica has been used to support the creation of numerous characters within the game, and indeed I've made use of all of these sources to various extents when creating characters within the game. And in this, Crusader Kings II, the database within the game shares several similarities with databases which are being produced in a more academic context. So these two in particular, the prosopography of Anglo-Saxon England and the making of Charlemagne's Europe, are basically multi-year-long projects which have looked at huge reams of sources to construct relationship networks, to look at who is connected to whom within Europe in this period. There are a lot of similarities, there are a lot of surface similarities between the databases produced for these projects and the one used within Crusader Kings. What the difference though? The difference between the database in Crusader Kings and these academic databases is Crusader is rife with inaccuracies. There are a huge number of details within the Crusader King database which are either incorrect or we simply cannot know. There are characters who didn't exist. And this has been one of the main reasons why games have typically been rejected as potential academic tools for the study of history. So, what I'm going to do over the course of the rest of this presentation is basically three things. First of all, I'm going to talk about why Crusader Kings is inaccurate and why it has to be inaccurate. I'm then going to go on and talk about what I would consider whether or not this inaccuracy is a problem for gameplay. And I'm going to, in fact, make the case that not only is this inaccuracy not a problem, it's beneficial and absolutely necessary. And finally, I'm going to talk fairly briefly about the academic potential of Crusader Kings II and games in general. We're going to make the case that the inaccuracies, the very reason why these games have been dismissed as historical research tools, we're going to make the case that these inaccuracies allow the exploration of history in a more abstract way, certainly, but they allow the creation of a fuller image of medieval society. So first of all, why is Crusader Kings II inaccurate? Why can you take the Count of Dublin and conquer the world? Why are so many of its characters inaccurate? Why do we have the wrong birth and death dates? Why do we have people married to fictional characters? There are several reasons for this. Perhaps most fundamentally are the mechanical requirements and limitations of the game engine. Because the game is essentially a model of medieval society, a vast model built on this huge database of characters. And in order for that model to function, you need a substantial number of characters at every level of society. And this is the core of the game. Without this vast database, you can't build the model, and without the model, you can't have the game. There's nothing to play. As a result, every slot needs to be filled effectively. This issue is compounded by the fact that we have a lack of data for many regions and many periods during the Middle Ages. So certainly, as we look towards the later Middle Ages, as we look towards Western Europe or the Middle East or over into India, we have a huge amount of data about not only who was ruling kingdoms and empires, but those who sat beneath them. We know who the kings were, we know who the dukes were, and have a decent idea about who the counts were. But as we move further forward in time, and as we look further down the social scale, we get increasingly less data. So if you're trying to find the identity of a lowly count in Scotland in the early part of the 8th century, you're simply not going to be able to establish who was in charge of which particular region. And this lack of data means that when these characters are required to fit the database, they have to be created often from scratch. And this will be done with the best guess. This will be done so a character will be created who looks like they'll fit and make sense within the parts of the system, the parts of the database that we do know. but nevertheless they are creative, they are a fictional character in effect. The issue is further compounded by the fact that much of this data is disputed, or at least the way to interpret much of this data is disputed. Very often we don't know how to deal with these different accounts. And this is a particular issue when it comes to the creation of games. These games are notoriously find it notoriously difficult to represent both sides of any dispute. Because these disputes, these arguments form the basis of the game's mechanics. And for the mechanics to run, the mechanics to function, they have to follow a single argument. For this reason, almost every historical game follows one particular argument. They can't have this sort of nuance that you perhaps find in another source, in another form of media. As a result, we've almost certainly got data in there, that we've got characters in there, we've got a system, a model, which many historians would disagree with. There are also research limitations faced by the designers, and this is something that even academics face increasingly over the pandemic. We've had difficulty accessing the primary sources, the data which is required to construct this database, to construct this model of medieval society. And beyond this, and possibly most importantly, the game has to be balanced, or at least has to be fun. And to this end, we see a lot of characters being inflated, being created, being used to create a more fun, a more enjoyable experience for the player. So an example of this is King Charles, the future Emperor Charlemagne. And Charlemagne has been given very heavily inflated stats. He's a nightmare to face on the battlefield. And this is partly because, well, he was, by all accounts, a successful military leader. But it's also so the player has something fun to do. It's great to be able to drop into the shoes of one of these legendary figures and lead your army almost invincibly around the map. Things have been exaggerated within the database in order to facilitate player experience. So is this inaccuracy a problem when it comes to gameplay? And as I've suggested, I don't think that it is. And in fact, I'd go so far as to say that these inaccuracies are necessary, because as I've said, the game relies on this vast database of characters, and the creation of the level of detail necessary for the game to run simply isn't possible using only what we know more or less for certain from the historical sources. The game is obliged to create, the designers are obliged to create characters to fill in these gaps within the database. They're obliged to pick one particular historical argument to support their model of society. There's simply no other way in which the game can function. Beyond this, these inaccuracies allow access to interesting characters and a more enjoyable experience for the player. Another example of this is Houghton, a semi-mythical Viking warlord from the 9th century. Within the game, like Charlemagne, he's been given inflated stats. He's a hugely accomplished general, but he's also competent in a vast range of other areas. We don't know much about Houghton at all, but by doing this, the designers have created a character for the players to use to experience many of the mechanics they've developed to facilitate Viking raids, Viking invasions, and they've given players an ideal character to do this with, to get the hang of the mechanics. And perhaps at a more basic level as well, these inaccuracies facilitate gameplay. So one of the more common issues facing players when the game was first released was that if they picked a character particularly towards the lower ends of the social structures, particularly early on within the game's timeline, when they picked these characters, there would only be a very rough outline, a very rough skeleton of their family, of their dynasty. Typically, it would just be father to son running right the way through the game. So if you started a game and picked any character at random, there was a reasonable chance that they wouldn't be married and they wouldn't have any children. This is an issue within Crusader Kings because you play as a dynasty. When your character dies, you move on to play as their heir, typically one of their sons or occasionally their brother, their nephew, or what have you. And this caused a great deal of frustration amongst the player base. It meant that many players were losing, they were having an early game over, often through matters completely out of their hands. Characters could die at random at almost any point. It was unlikely until they reached old age, but it was still perfectly possible for your 22-year-old king to die without warning. In order to get around this, the developers created this option in the main menu, and by default, the game will create families for characters who don't have wives, who don't have children. This means that when the player starts the game, they're considerably less likely to have a game over immediately. We see a more fully populated Europe, albeit a Europe populated potentially predominantly by fictional characters. So, as I've said then, these inaccuracies, they're not at all a problem for gameplay, and in fact, they not only facilitate it, they make it possible to have a game at all. So how can we get around this? Do we need to get around these inaccuracies if we want to use games like Crusader Kings as a model for how to approach history through games, historical research through games, rather? So first of all, it's important to stress that Crusader Kings II is not an academic database. I'm not making the claim that you can use Crusader Kings in the same way as you could the making of Charlemagne's Europe, for example. This inaccurate data, this fabricated data, will completely derail many of the activities you could hope to use the database for. But we can use this database and we can use the game in very different ways, which I think are still useful for us as historians. Fundamentally, Crusader Kings II is still history. The developers have created a vast model of medieval society. And in many respects, they've created a very useful image of medieval politics. So what we've got here, this is an example from the family tree of William the Conqueror. And this is after the game has been running for a while. So this is the sort of family which could emerge from William. Many of these characters don't exist or existed in a different format. The game is not giving us access to the accurate data about this period, but it is giving us access to an image, a model of medieval politics and society, which, while it's more abstract than that provided by more traditional databases, it's still useful for us as historians, and in fact in many ways it's more useful. While it shares similarities to academic history, and I'm shamelessly using an example from my own work, these are the relationship networks that we can confirm around 5 successive kings of Italy. And you get a very similar image if you run the Crusader Kings II database through a similar piece of relationship network mapping software. So we see a lot of similarities with the rough models which we can produce with these known figures, with these connections that we can confirm. And this inaccuracy, I think, can become a strength because it gives us a more complete picture. So it's a more abstract picture, but it's a more complete picture. Because very often when we're conducting our historical research, when we're looking to construct these databases, these models of society, we're limited by the figures that we know about. We only ever have a very scattered snapshot of society. We can't see the full picture. And by creating characters, by filling in these gaps, we can get a much clearer and in many ways more useful model of the past. And I should say just before I wrap up that this is not really that dissimilar from what academic historians do in their writing, in their articles and in their monographs. Because while these databases, while the making of Charlemagne's Europe is very firmly rooted in what we can call from the sources, the primary sources, when we take that data, when we use it as the basis to write an article, we use it as the basis to describe a model, a vision, an argument about medieval society. When we do that, we're in effect doing the exact same thing as the developers of Crusader Kings II did when they've created this fabricated database and they've created this model of medieval society. In both cases, whether you're an academic historian or a game dev, you're creating an abstraction based on data points. So perhaps it's better to look at Crusader Kings II not so much as a database, but as an argument about what medieval society looked like. It's not raw data, but it's analysis. So, to wrap things up then, I apologise I have gone slightly over time here. I've got four points I'd like to leave you with. So first of all, Crusader Kings II is inaccurate. There's no getting around this. However, this makes for a better game. These inaccuracies, in fact, they're necessary to have a game which functions at all. Further, this is a different way of exploring the past. It allows us very different access to medieval history, to medieval society, from that provided by the more traditional academic databases. It may be inaccurate, it may be abstract, but it's more complete. And finally, I think this is still valid. I think this is still a valid and useful approach whereby we can use a game as a means of exploring history in an academic fashion. And as I've said, I think the key point here is we need to stop looking at the game as a representation of data, but instead we look at the game Crusader Kings II, or whatever it is, we look at the game as an argument about the past. So that's everything from me. Thank you so much for having me here, and thank you once again to the organisers. I hope everyone is having a great conference, and I look forward to fielding any questions from you all. Thank you.